I'm Bonnie Burnham. I'm the president of the World Monuments Fund, and it's a pleasure to invite many friends that we've seen over the years to our annual Paul Mellon Lecture, which is an opportunity to gather our immediate New York area crowd and have an opportunity to show you and talk about some of the things that we're doing around the world. So I'd like to thank the estate of Paul Mellon for the generous support of our education endowment that's made it possible for us to do this. We have a really interesting and exciting topic tonight in the form of a discussion about the efforts to save the colonial center of Yangon in Burma or Myanmar, depending on which you prefer to say, and our speaker will perhaps explain the subtleties of those differences. It's a city that has been spared by isolation over the last 2 or 3 decades, and as a result, quietly sleeping in oblivion and quietly disappearing somewhat as time goes by. But with the recent political changes, Burma is coming alive again. I'm sure many of you have traveled there. Some people tonight were with us about a year ago when WMF had a trip there. And we realized the vulnerability of this gorgeous place and the rare opportunity that it represents to save an Asian colonial city. There aren't many that really survive the changes that have occurred in the transformation of traditional cities into global centers over the last decade or 20 years. And so we are standing now at a crossroads in Yangon where real estate values are rising, demand is tremendous, and very little in place to protect what's there. And you'll hear much more about this in the course of the evening. We have a very, very interesting speaker, Dr. Thant Myint-U, who is an American-born Burmese, educated here in the United States at Harvard with a doctorate from Cambridge University, very well-known historian whose books have been on the bestseller list, including the River of Lost Footsteps, about his own experience with Burma. He's also been part of diplomatic efforts in relation to UN activities, the UN peacekeeping forces in Cambodia and Bosnia in particular, both places where his footsteps and ours have crossed over time, where WMF has been very active. After visiting last year, we included the Yangon Historic Center on the World Monuments Watch List because of the fragile qualities of the place. And after watch listing, we were able to attract a donor who has provided some support for us to come together with the Yangon Heritage Trust, headed by Dr. Thant, and organize a consciousness-raising session for the Burmese government that will allow them to better understand the values of what's there and the potentials to save them through all kinds of preservation mechanisms and incentives that we have found were successful in other parts of the world. So we're very excited about organizing that program next fall. We're very grateful to the Nyarkos Foundation for having provided the funding to make it possible. And you'll hear much more about the subtleties of this situation and what we're going to try to achieve from Dr. Thant. So I'm now pleased to welcome him on behalf of all of us.
Thank you very much, Bonnie. I'm very happy to be here today. I'd like to thank the World Monument Fund for the kind invitation to come back to New York, which is actually my hometown, and to talk to you about Rangoon or Yangon or Burma in Myanmar. I'll use both. I tend to use Rangoon more out of habit than anything else, but I'll also use Yangon, which is the city where I'm living now and have lived for the past few years. And it's a city that's been very important to me for a long time, and it's a city where both of my parents are from as well. Yangon is, as I think most of you know, a city in the in lower Burma or lower Myanmar, in the southern half of the country. It's a city today of about 5 to 6 million people. No one knows for certain. There hasn't been a proper census in the country since 1931. It sits not too far from the Bay of Bengal, and it is bounded to the south by 2 rivers which have its confluence there, and to the north, it's about 10 miles to the airport strip that you can see in the far north over here. It's a city that was the capital until 2006, when the military government at the time moved the capital to Naypyidaw, and it remains the largest city in the country in terms of population, and it remains the most important commercial and business hub in the country as well. Yangon, or Rangoon, even though in many ways it's a colonial city, or a city that developed in colonial times, its early history actually goes back much further. The Shwedagon pagoda that you saw in the first slide is a religious site, a religious structure that goes back at least to the 15th century, and most of the Burmese faithful sort of believe it goes back much further in time. And there was around the Shwedagon pagoda settlements going back many hundred years before the 15th century. It was a port under the Burmese kings in the late 18th and early 19th century, and by the time of the First Anglo-Burmese War, it was the second most important city in the Burmese kingdom, the most important being the royal capitals to the north. This is a photograph from the very early British period, but it shows you the Shwedagon pagoda in the background and the early settlements that would have been closer to the river. This is one of the very few maps that we have of Rangoon before colonial rule, and the city of Rangoon, the city of Rangoon really was just this almost this island where the downtown area is now, with the Sule Pagoda, which is also part of downtown, being just to the northwest. Most of the town would have been wooden structures, plus some of the Christian churches, the mosques, the customs house would have been the only brick structures in the old town. The First Anglo-Burmese War was in 1824 to 1825. The British occupied the city for a year and a half, 2 years before handing it back to the Burmese at the end of the war as part of a treaty. There was a second Anglo-Burmese War in 1852 to 53, and that time the British decided to stay, and they annexed what was then Lower Burma and began to develop Rangoon as an important port as part of British India. This is from the First Anglo-Burmese War and shows the amphibious assault of the East India Company on the old stockaded town of Rangoon, which is now the downtown. They developed Rangoon as a port city. It was the capital of British Burma. The Kingdom of Burma was overthrown and annexed in 1885, 1886. And they developed the downtown area more or less as on a grid pattern from the 1860s onwards. What you see in the south in the grid area was the main business district and the center of the city. The cantonment area would have been where most of the Europeans resided and where the military base was as well. And the city gradually expanded northwards over the course of the late 19th century and early 20th century. This is a photograph of Merchant Street, which is one of the 4 main avenues that go from east to west. There are also 57 streets that go from east to west, and 4 avenues that go from north to south. Merchant Street was one of the bigger ones. This is very early in the days of British rule. This photograph was taken in the 1860s. By the turn of the century, in the early 20th century, Rangoon had become a very cosmopolitan city. It was a city that received a huge amount of immigration from across India, from all parts of India. There were Gujaratis, Punjabis, Bengalis, people from the far north to the far south of India. And Rangoon, especially downtown Rangoon, became almost 80% Indian, and the city as a whole over 60% people from India. There were many different religious sites, mosques, churches, Jewish synagogues, as well as Buddhist temples, Chinese temples. You see here in the upper right the Sofer family's shop. In the 1870s, the Sofers were one of the leading Burmese Jewish families. Rangoon at that time had a very large Jewish population of over 2,000 out of a total population of about 400,000 before the war. This is Rangoon, I would think probably around the turn of the century. This is the Strand, the main road along the waterfront at the time. This is a photograph of the Sule Pagoda, which was the center of the grid around which the British planned the modern city. The British, if you remember the map before of pre-colonial Rangoon, the British drained the swamps and the marshes that had been around the old town, filled in that land, that area, and built the grid pattern on top of that. The building to the left is the old Favorite department store, which was one of the two big department stores that were constructed in the very end of the 19th century. This is Solomon's, another Jewish company that was well known in Rangoon at the turn of the century. This is probably from about 1915. And this is Rangoon on the eve of the Second World War. You have the avenues going from left to right, the waterfront and the warehouses at the top, and the Sule Pagoda again at the center of the grid. In the 1940s, in 1941, Christmas Eve 1941 and Boxing Day 1941 saw Burma brought into the Second World War. There was a Japanese bombing of the city that left over 2,000 people dead on those 2 days, and considerable destruction, not on the level of Mandalay and other cities that were almost completely destroyed, but Rangoon did suffer quite severe bomb damage, both in 1941, 42, and also towards the end of the war in 1945 as well. Rangoon before the war was a place which attracted lots of different famous visitors and people who lived there, like Pablo Neruda. I actually live in the building right now where Pablo Neruda lived in 1927. And it was also, of course, the home of many different companies that went on to regional or even global fame, like Tiger Bomb and British Petroleum, which was, of course, an outgrowth of Burma Oil. This is Rangoon during World War II, and this was the definitive shift in the history of Burma in the 20th century with the Japanese ouster of the British and then the British return in 1945. Independence from Britain came in 1948, and then that was followed by 14 years of semi-democratic government and then the military coup of 1962 and the beginning of military rule, which has ended only very recently. One of the things that we try to say to Burmese audiences especially is that even though downtown Rangoon is very much a colonial landscape in terms of the buildings and the time period in which it was built, that it's a landscape that's incredibly important for the history of the country and the history of anti-colonialism and the history of Burmese nationalism as well. The gentleman in the center, General Aung San, is the father of the Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi. Behind him is U Nu, who became prime minister in the 1950s. This was during one of his landmark speeches. He's on his way to Parliament in 1947, just before he was assassinated. But all of these buildings that I'll show you are buildings which, again, even though they were built in colonial times, are buildings that are incredibly important for the history of the country. This is a photograph of the Shwedagon Pagoda and the stairs up to the Shwedagon Pagoda taken just after independence in 1948. This is Rangoon in the 1950s. You had a lot of bomb damage in the 1940s, and a lot of infill sites then a lot of new buildings were constructed in the very late 1940s, very early 1950s, including on this road. But the general landscape and geography of the city remained largely unchanged. The big difference between Rangoon of the 1950s and the Rangoon of the 1930s and early 40s was the increase in population. You had a lot of war refugees and displaced persons coming in as a result of the war, and also as a result of the civil war that was taking place in the country from 1949 onwards as well. This is a photograph from the early 1960s in Rangoon. And again, most of the buildings were unchanged since before World War II or British times. What you did see during the period of military rule, which then lasted from, well, the initial period of military rule lasted from 1962 to 1988. And during that period, because there was almost no, or very little economic growth, there was almost no interaction with the rest of the world. This was the height of what was called the Burmese way to socialism and Burmese isolationism. You also saw almost no change to the physical fabric of the city. There were a couple of exceptions. The old government house, which was the home of the British governors as well as Burmese presidents after the war, was torn down I think in either the very late 1970s or early 1980s, and then replaced with this Parliament building, which was built in the 1980s. Also Jubilee Hall, which is, again, it was a colonial building, but it was an incredibly important building for Burmese history. It's where General Aung San and his colleagues who were assassinated were laid in state in 1947. It was a museum also for many decades, was torn down in the 1970s as well and replaced with this Defense Services Museum, which is still there today. But with these couple of exceptions of major buildings that came down or were demolished by the orders of the then dictator General Ne Win, most of the city was unchanged from the 1950s until the late 1980s and early 1990s. What you then began to see after 1988 was the partial opening up of the country. We had a pro-democracy uprising that was crushed, but then we had a general reorientation of the government in the late 80s and early 90s away from what was called Burmese socialism to a much less isolationist set of policies. The government was interested in attracting foreign investment and foreign trade and tourism as well. And you had the partial privatization of the economy and the encouragement of local private businesses. And so what you had very suddenly in the early 1990s was a huge amount of new and generally very cheap construction going up in Rangoon, especially from about 1991 to 1995. You had lots of buildings in the old downtown, hundreds of buildings. I can't put an exact number on it, but I would say in the early 1990s, at least 200 or 300 buildings in the old downtown torn down and replaced with these buildings. This one would have been built in the 90s, this one much more recently. Without any sort of sense of compatibility or sympathy for the environment around it. This is the headquarters of a bank of a leading Burmese businessman. This is the old favorite department store that I showed you in the earlier slide. And this would have been the street in that slide of Burma just before Rangoon, just before the war, with the trees and the broad sort of walking avenues that again had been almost unchanged until the 1990s. And then you have, of course, this general sort of trend towards new condominiums. Hundreds of buildings have been built, not just in the central area, but the city has kind of sprawled and expanded to several times its original limits to the north, and then across the river to the west, and across the river to the east as well. It's probably several times larger than the city that the British left in 1948. And these are just examples of some of the newer buildings and hotels. This is a hotel that have been built over the past 15 years. This street, for example, this is York Road, would have been just a collection of old teak and maybe some brick houses up until 20 years ago. And you have here the old Presbyterian church, which is now completely surrounded by new buildings. But some streets remain very much the same. This is, our office is in this building. This is Fair Street, which is now called Bansudan Street. And you can see from this photograph from the 1920s and this photograph from this past year that everything on this, all the buildings on this street remain completely intact. And you have, of course, the Shwedagon and the views of the Shwedagon from many different parts of the city. It's on a hill in the middle of the old historic city, and the views of the Shwedagon still remain unhindered from many different directions. In terms of what we have still today, we've done the Yangon Heritage Trust has done an inventory over the past year and a half of the 6 main townships downtown, so the old central business district. And we've surveyed surveyed about 4,000 buildings altogether. About 25% of the buildings in the old downtown are buildings built since 1990. Of the rest, the majority are colonial buildings from pre-1948, and the rest are buildings that were built in the bomb-damaged sites in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Many of these old colonial buildings are still there downtown. This is the largest, the old Secretariat, which was the center of British administration and the center of the Burmese government until the 2000s. It's not being used right now. It's owned by the Burmese government. This is the interior of the old Bank of Bengal building. Again, in many of these old buildings, I mean, you have a new desk there, but a lot of the interiors remain virtually unchanged since the 1930s and 1940s. This is also the interior of another bank building. I think this could either be the Secretariat or the Accountant General's office, but one of the buildings downtown. This is the High Court, which was built at the turn of the century. This is the High Court today. Again, virtually unchanged. This park in the front was a park that we helped work on over the past year and a half. Until a year and a half ago, it was entirely closed off by barbed wire, but it's been opened up to the public and hundreds of people use it now every day. This is one of my favorite buildings. This is the Balthasar Building, which was owned by the Armenian Balthasar family, which was a leading, there was a sizable or significant Armenian community in Burma. And the Balthasars were one of the leading Armenian commercial families in Rangoon. The downstairs was the offices of Siemens, the German Siemens company. This is the same building today. You can see the trees growing out of the sides of the building. And this building, I'll say more about similar conditions elsewhere later, but this building is a good example of the kind of problems that we're facing. You have two different government ministries that have, I guess in the past, nationalized Balthasars and nationalized Siemens that own bits of the building. You have other tenants who've been squatting or who've been living in the building for a long period of time and who cannot be removed under current government policy. And then you have other small offices actually in the building. The building is actually could be quite dangerous. It hasn't been repaired or undergone any kind of renovation for 60, 70 years. There are families, kids living in the building. But to do something with the building, we would have to get the permission of both government ministries and all the different 20 or 30 different families who are living in the building right now. But I'll say more about that later because it's one of our key challenges. This is the old Accountant General's office. This building actually suffered direct Japanese bomb damage in Boxing Day 1941, and this whole side of the building collapsed, and it was never repaired. And so you see the building is still there with the side of the building down. This is now used as a divisional court, but in about a month's time it will be empty because the divisional court is moving somewhere else. And so here's an opportunity to try to do something new with this building, and I think the government is open right now to ideas, and we've been in discussion with the government about the future of this building. Again, these are other buildings that remain downtown. These are what are called the new law courts. They were built in the 1930s. They're right on the Strand with the waterfront to the left. This is also an example of a building which was leased out to a local company, which is meant to renovate this and turn it into a hotel. But there have been all kinds of problems with that process. This is the old PGU Club, which was the apex social club in British times. It was taken over by the Army. It served as the Army Accounts Office for 2 decades, and it's been abandoned. It's owned by the Army, but it's derelict. I mean, no one uses it right now. This is the inside of the PGU Club. This is where Rudyard Kipling stayed one night. His one night in Rangoon I think in 1887. And it was in this PGU Club that he came up with the idea of his poem, The Road to Mandalay. This is the interior of this is also the PGU Club. This was part of the old dining room at the PGU Club. And you have lots of these kinds of buildings downtown. This was a Scottish company mainly a rice trading company on the street very close to our office. And then, of course, in addition to the commercial buildings, you have a lot of old residential buildings, but hundreds of these teak buildings, these teak homes have been knocked down over the past 15 years. This is one of, still, I would guess, several dozen that remain in the historic sort of city center. This building, this house is owned by the Army, and it's within an Army compound. And many of the buildings are residential buildings like these. This is on a street adjacent to where our office is. One of the problems that we have is that, over the past, as you know, over the past couple of years, there's been this reform effort in the country. The country's opened up. There's a lot of foreign investment interest. There's a lot of desire by the government to attract foreign investment. The political environment is much more liberal. The media is much more free. And the government has decided 2 years ago, to liberalize the car market, which had been extremely tightly controlled. And the number of cars in Rangoon went from 80,000 to 280,000 within 12 months. The price of a decent car went from about $80,000, $90,000 to about $5,000, $6,000, making it much more affordable to middle-class Burmese people. And so you have these enormous traffic jams in the city. But in general, the big push, as you can imagine, in a country which has been isolated and which has been left behind from the economic progress in the rest of the region, is this push for modernization. It's not for conservation. It's a desire for cars. It's a desire for shopping malls. It's a desire for new buildings of all kinds. And even though there is growing public support for conserving a lot of the old the built heritage in the city, it sits against this great momentum for the modernization of the city as people in the city see it. These are the new flyovers that have been built as a result of the traffic jam. This is just to the north of the city center, where you see some new buildings that have been built. And one really, I think, terrible sort of consequence of this liberalization of the car market, the traffic jams, the political pressure on the government to relieve the city of traffic jams, has been the tearing up of the narrowing of the sidewalks, where you've traditionally had a lot of very vibrant sidewalk culture, and the sidewalks have been narrowed from where you can see on the left to these very narrow high sidewalks now on the right in a lot of the old downtown. And you still have a lot of new buildings going up all the time in the old downtown area. What you've also had over the past 2 years is very high-level engagement by the Japanese aid agency JICA. Even before the reforms began in 2011, the Japanese government approached the Myanmar government and offered its assistance on developing a new master plan for the city. And the master plan it's now done. It's basically an infrastructure plan looking at things like sewage and transport and sanitation and water. And it's been now given over to the Myanmar government in the hope that the Myanmar government will accept most or all of it, and that Japanese companies backed by multi-billion-dollar Japanese loans will be able to help develop this new infrastructure. And we have tried to engage with JICA to make sure that these new infrastructure plans do not go against some of our aims and efforts related to conservation. One big problem in the beginning had been ideas about building a bridge from, this is the old downtown area, right across to the area just across the river. And because of the ships going across this part of the river, there was an initial idea to really raise and tear down the entire downtown to build an up-ramp for the bridge that would have come across. But that particular project seems to be shelved, at least for now. We established, well, I did with a few other people, established the Yangon Heritage Trust almost exactly 2 years ago, following discussions with ministers in the new government, both at the capital in Naypyidaw and in Rangoon. And for many months, I mean, the big focus of our attention was highest level advocacy. This was at the beginning of the transition away from military dictatorship and authoritarian government to to a freer and in some ways more democratic government, but still it was a very top-down system. And I had wanted to see if there was any interest at all from the president and others in the new government for this, to try to conserve the old the buildings. And this is not my background at all. As Bonnie mentioned, my background is as a historian and as a someone who's worked in the UN. And my initial interest was very much in trying to save at least the 40, 50, 60 iconic colonial era buildings downtown. And I spoke initially to the chief minister of the city as well as to key ministers. And they were actually surprisingly very encouraging. This was, I think the timing was actually very good. This was at a time when the new government had just come into power. They were looking for new ideas, new approaches, new policies. And so this seemed to be something different and something that they understood could be valuable. And I made the pitch to them that this could be valuable in terms of future tourism revenue, that this was important to our own history. It wasn't just about colonial history and colonial architecture. And also that if we were able in some way to modernize the city, but to integrate this, this heritage, this built heritage, one of the last remaining late 19th, early 20th century urban landscapes left in Asia, that we would have something very special that no other city in the region would have. And this would be a priceless asset in terms of the competitiveness of the city and the attractions of the city going forward. And these were all arguments that I think the ministers who listened to what I had to say tended to agree with. I think some of them might have been skeptical, but politely didn't say anything. But they generally sort of went along and encouraged me to set up the Yangon Heritage Trust, which I did in April of 2011. By February of 2012, I met with the president, U Thein Sein, who was also very encouraging. And I think it was that high-level advocacy, and a sense by the ministers and civil servants and city officials, that the president himself was supportive of trying to find ways to protect and conserve these old buildings, that we have managed to move as far as we have over the past year and a half. This has then led to a lot of public advocacy and engagement with government and other NGOs in the city, and also with local media. Our message then kind of expanded away from just a focus on the 40, 50 big iconic colonial era buildings to a much more a broader sort of vision of the city, taking on issues like the protection of the views of the Shwedagon pagoda, trying to preserve many of the green areas in the city, looking at ways in which the waterfront could be reused and redeveloped. And in all of these things, again, we engaged with different parts of the government, as well as with the public through the newly sort of freed up Burmese language media as well. We've been involved in addition to this high-level advocacy and public advocacy, we've also been involved in lots of other activities, a lot of training. There was no urban planning unit. I mean, in not a normal country, but in many other places, one would try to push for a conservation agenda as part of a broader urban planning process. But in Rangoon, there wasn't any broader urban planning process. And it was 2 years ago only that the first urban planning unit was established within the city government. And so we've been working quite closely with the 30 or 40 people in that unit and helping to facilitate funding for them and training for them in Australia and elsewhere in urban planning. We've also been, we've held different conferences, and one of the things, and also facilitated training in the city, again, for city officials as well as for others. We've also started, and we're about to put the first one up in a couple of weeks' time, these historical landmark plaques in the city. This was actually the idea of a minister in the president's office who went to Europe a year and a half ago and saw them somewhere in Europe and said we should do the same thing. And so we have a grant from the Philips Corporation to put up 200 of these plaques. And the first one will go up in City Hall in a couple of weeks' time. We also have started to provide tours, some to outsiders, but tourists and others who are visiting. But what we want to start doing over the coming month is to actually provide free tours to local residents and to school children as well, many of whom have no idea of the history that's surrounding them, even the people who live downtown. And of course, a lot of our effort over this initial year and a half has been towards the organizational development of the Yangon Heritage Trust. it's a difficult environment in which to set up an NGO. I mean, just getting a decent internet connection took many, many weeks. The prices of office space are now astronomical. So securing office space, we've now built it up to an organization of 15 people, 4 international staff and 11 Myanmar staff. And I think in terms of our achievements, I would say that probably our main achievement so far has been a negative achievement in the sense that we've stopped essentially the further demolition of old buildings downtown. And I think what could easily have been the case if we had not begun our advocacy, especially with government in 2011, is that we would have seen dozens of even the bigger colonial era buildings go down. And I think if a couple of dozen went down, then I think it would have been very difficult to save the rest. And again, as a result of this advocacy with the president and with others, there is now a policy in place to protect buildings on a city list now of 189 buildings. And as a matter of policy now, not law or official regulation, but as a matter of city policy, that any significant change, and certainly any demolition of a building in the downtown area will be done only in consultation with us. So there is a working policy in place that essentially establishes a conservation area around a couple of square miles downtown. The main way in which developers have been able to tear down or knock down a lot of these old buildings is through what was called the DB system, or the dangerous building system. If you take a building like this, it's a 4-story building. There would have been 4 different families living in them. You would have had a landowner who might have been from the family of the original landowners. There might be 10, 20, 30 descendants, all of whom grouped together to claim ownership of the land. But over time, they would have sold off different apartments. You have rent control in the city as well, so you might have people who've been there, then sublet their rent control space. And so the ownership is often contested. And it would have been impossible for anyone to come and buy the building. So what needed to be done was for a developer to have the building classified as a dangerous building. Often that person might pay a bribe to someone in City Hall, get the dangerous building certification. And that would mean that the building had to come down. And then they would go in at that point and do a deal with the owners of the land and the people living in the building, where they would be promised an apartment in the new, say, 12-story building that would go up in this place. And that was the kind of the incentive structure that was raising down one building after another. And so this building came down, and then there would be a 12-story building built in its place. That whole system of certifying buildings as dangerous buildings without any actual proper assessment of the building has now been stopped. And just that alone has meant that about 47 or 48 buildings that were about to be demolished in 2011 and 2012 were stopped. This is an example of one of the buildings on the DB list, the Old Bombay Burma Press building. The problem for us, or the challenge for us, has been the government halted the demolition of all these buildings, but then gave every developer and tenant our telephone number. And so then it was up to us, and it still is up to us, to try to find some kind of solution. And as you can imagine, for a lot of tenants, I mean, they want to live in a modern building, or at least something that has proper plumbing or electricity that works. And so in that way, even though we've managed to pause the demolitions, I mean, we are under a lot of pressure to help the government or work with the city authorities in coming up with a solution to these 40 or 50 buildings whose demolition we've halted. You have buildings like the Sofair building, the family who had that small business in one of the early black and white photographs. They went on in 1906, I think, to build this very grand building. They went bankrupt about 10 years later. But this is also an example of a very contested ownership system structure. No one really owns this entire building. You have different ministries that own sections of it because they nationalized some firms. You have businesses that have been there, and so no one can really kick them out. You have 17 families that live on these 2 floors who've also kind of acquired rights in different ways. And then you have a family that lives right up there. They somehow bought it from someone in 1945 and has lived there since 1945. 1945 or so they claim. You have these old houses as well, where sometimes the ownership is contested, but also houses which belong to different parts of the government, and the future use of these houses is not coordinated as well. This is another building, a state-owned building. This is actually a building owned by the special branch of the police, part of the Home Ministry in Rangoon. And then you have a lot of this, again, modernization pressure. And one of our sort of maybe second sort of area of achievement is we've managed to stop or at least modify some of these projects. The worst one, I think, would have been the one in the bottom here, which there was a beautiful old building here that was knocked down 4 years ago before we came. This building here is the Indian Embassy. It used to be the Oriental Assurance Company. And the developer wanted to build this 43-story building right there. And it had come to the point, and this is really the heart of our conservation area, and it had come to the point where, even though the Indian Embassy had protested, the Indian Embassy was informed by the Burmese Foreign Ministry that construction was going to start soon, so I think this was imminent. But we pushed quite hard and eventually publicly as well through the local media. And then we were formally asked by the President's office for our opinion on this. We gave our reasons for why we didn't think it should go forward. And so then it was stopped. But the way in which it was stopped was that the President's office said that they didn't say that nothing could be built, and they didn't say what could be built. They simply said nothing can be built which would harm the heritage fabric of this area. And so that means, again, it's a little bit like with the DB buildings, the pressure is on us to try to find the right solution for this area, because I think that the developer still wants to build something. And in terms of the height of the building he can build and the type of building he can build, in a way, this can be the kind of model for what might be possible elsewhere as well. We also have scored, I think, an important victory in relation to the waterfront. This is the Rangoon River. The existing plan, the Rangoon River, the waterfront all along the river for several miles in both directions is owned by the Port Authority, which is part of the Ministry of Transport. The existing plan, which was conceived in the days of the old military regime, was to keep the port facilities where they are, even though a new, much bigger port is being built further to the south, and then to tender off all the land, green land in between, to local construction companies to build high-rise buildings. And that would have blocked off the entire old town from the river and prevented any public access to the river. And we've been lobbying for this area to become an open and green and publicly accessible area, and then to have low-rise buildings to the sides, and then to restrict high-rise buildings to at least many blocks in both directions. And this was the original plan. They had tendered off, or part of the original plan, they had tendered off the land, and these big building projects had been approved. But partly because of our advocacy, and partly because of the advocacy or the position of now our new partners in the urban planning unit in the city government that we've been working very closely with, this has been stopped just 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. But again, what's not clear is what should then come in its place. So again, we've managed to do the negative thing in terms of stopping certain things, but we need to now work quite hard with the city government in particular in coming up with alternative solutions. We've also been successful, well, semi-successful so far, at beginning discussions with government on the reuse of state-owned building. In 1962, the government, the military government, when it took over, nationalized a lot of buildings. This is Standard Chartered. It was actually before World War II, a quarter of all of Standard Chartered's operations were in Burma. And its office here in Rangoon was 3 times the size of its office in Shanghai. This building was built in 1939, 1940. And we've been in discussions with both Standard Chartered and also with the government on the possible reuse of this building. This is now a government bank, only partially used. Standard Chartered is interested in renovating it and then having a small representative office in that space. But we're also involved in a few other building possible reuse projects. This is Gandhi Hall, which used to be the Rangoon Times before World War II. It was then bought by the governments of Burma and India as a memorial to Mahatma Gandhi. There was a museum display, and then there was a big public event space that was used for many historic occasions over the past 50 years. Over the past 50 years, the control of this had gone to a body of trustees who are now in their 80s. And they wanted to knock it down and build an 18-story condominium. And through a sort of slightly convoluted logic, they said that because they'd worked so hard in protecting this for 50 years, they felt they deserved the right to knock it down now and build a condominium, and that they had many debts that they needed to pay off. But we are working with both the Myanmar government and the government of India now on a project to restore this building to its original purpose, actually, which would be partly an exhibition or a memorial to Mahatma Gandhi or to India-Burma relations, but also a public event space and maybe other retail space downstairs. We've also been working with the government on changes in many aspects of their policy. I'd mentioned already the dangerous building policy, but they are also in the government, the city government has also been drafting a new zoning plan for the city, and the mayor has asked us to be on that committee drafting the zoning plan. I can go into more detail perhaps if we have time, but essentially it's still a somewhat confused exercise that's not yet completed. There are many developer and business interests that are wary of the zoning plan. There are several dozen projects that have been proposed that would go against the zoning plan as it now exists in draft form. We have also proposed this initial conservation zone. This would be about a mile, I think, in length around the old downtown. And that has been accepted in principle, and the city government has asked us to help in developing guidelines for what can and cannot be allowed within the conservation zone. I think one area in which we've also been successful is in raising public awareness internationally, but also locally as well. And in a way, I think now, even without our intervention or without our comment, you see in Myanmar media and in social media the idea of the importance of conserving some of our old heritage coming up much more. And so I think we've been at least somewhat successful at raising public awareness of the value of these old buildings. Briefly, in terms of the challenges that we face, I mean, going back to these government-owned buildings that I mentioned before, they're owned by different ministries. The ministries are not coordinated. It's like a little bit like in Malaysia when the government moved from Kuala Lumpur to the new capital in Putrajaya. They left behind a huge real estate portfolio without any clear policy or strategy in terms of what to do with that real estate portfolio. Because there's so many priorities in the country right now, there isn't an overall framework for what to do with them. So many of them are abandoned, many of them are not used, many of them are semi-used, and there's no incentive on the part of the ministries to come up with a creative idea, because if, for them, it's the equivalent of saying they have too much office space, the building would then be, could be leased out, but then the revenues coming from the leasing of the building would go to the central treasury and not to the government ministry itself. And so one thing that we've advocated with the president is the establishment of a task force on the government side, and we would work with that task force in trying to come up with an overall strategy for what is a multi-billion-dollar real estate portfolio, state-owned property in Rangoon. The second problem are these are private buildings. As I mentioned before, you have enormous legal challenges, contested ownership, as well as social challenges where you have people living in the buildings who are paying $1 in rent or $5 in rent, and it's not clear exactly what the right policies would be that would both protect some of the more vulnerable families living downtown, but also try to maintain what is still a very multi-ethnic, multi-faith, and multi-income environment or mixed income environment in the old city. We have huge problems with limited government capacity. As I mentioned before, I think the government is divided between the union level and the region level, and then at the city level, and sometimes there's not a clear delineation of responsibilities between the different sides. And very limited capacity, technical capacity. Almost no workers in Rangoon now have any experience working in brick. They've only had experience building the very cheap concrete and glass buildings that have gone up over the last 20 years. So even if we wanted to start working on conservation projects, we would find limitations in terms of the workforce and the technical capacity that's available. You do have, though, some renovations that have gone on and the successful reuse of some buildings over the past 5 or 10 years. But these generally have been for high-end, expat-oriented or tourist-oriented projects, and not for projects related to the ordinary local residents in the downtown area. This is just another example of office space, building that has been renovated for office space over the past couple of years. Politically, it's a very fragile environment. This event, which happened a year and a half ago, actually has been a really important marker for us. I showed you before a photograph of the new law courts. The new law courts were leased out to a company 2 years ago. That company, the judges and the lawyers who had been working in that company, in that building, were asked to leave. And this is in the days of the old military regime, so they were asked to leave in a very hasty way, more or less kicked out of the building over a 24-hour period. Now in this new, more open political environment, those same lawyers who were kicked out demonstrated against the government and are now suing the minister who they believe responsible for that action. So from the point of view of the president, I think, and many senior people in government, they have a general sense that, you know, what I'm saying is something that they agree with, that they want to conserve these buildings, that they want to find the right reuse for a lot of these buildings. But they also feel that this whole issue is a minefield because of the contested ownerships, because of all kinds of sensitivities around the use and the reuse of these buildings. And so in a way, I think the government would like us to help find the way forward and to also bring public opinion on side. One of the things that the president said to me when I met him on this a year ago was to really help with public outreach and not just explain all these things to him, but to go on radio and television and to try to make sure that we have maximum public support. So what we're trying to do right now, in addition to many of the other things that I've explained, is really to maximize our public outreach and advocacy in the Burmese language locally. We have now a city that's clearly at an inflection point. We have the potential for big growth in the tourist sector, for much greater investment. There's all kinds of modern pressures on the city. But we have a degree of public and political support. And so if we're going to use this window of opportunity, now that we've paused a lot of the demolitions, if we're able to move to the next stage and show a reuse of these buildings in a way to incorporate the existing architectural fabric into a much more modern city, it's a window of opportunity we really have to use over the next 12 to 18 months. This is our office. We're on a floor of the Yangon Heritage Trust is on a floor. We really have a few specific needs right now. One is just organizational support funding for us as an organization. It's not an expensive organization. Myanmar staff are paid Myanmar salaries, which are still relatively low by international standards. Our operating costs are about $200,000 a year for all our staff and other costs. We need the kinds of help in terms of advocacy and advocacy tools that can help to make the case to local residents and to people in Rangoon. The problem, as I mentioned before, is that for a lot of these tenants in these buildings, the feeling is that we are what's standing between them and a new apartment in at least a slightly more modern building. And so one of the things that we're thinking of doing is establishing just a small fund where we can provide some basic repairs and help to tenants in these buildings. And that wouldn't be very expensive. It would cost $20,000, $30,000 for some of these buildings. But I think in terms of our public outreach and trying to understand also some of the situation in some of these buildings, it would be very useful. This is an example also of a building that could come down if there wasn't some support over the coming months. We also have been working a little bit with the US government and also with the US Embassy on a couple of projects that the US Embassy has been very interested in and we've been very happy to work on as well. This is one of the last remaining early 20th century cinemas. It was originally a theater and then a cinema. 4 other cinemas were knocked down just over the last few years. This is the last one of 2 that remains on that row. It's a 1924, 1925 theater. And one project that the US Embassy has been working with us on is the possible restoration of this cinema. Here you have President Obama in Burma last year. And we've also begun some discussions about the possible reuse of the old American embassy. The American embassy has moved to a new location. And the president of Burma, not President Obama, has been very keen that there be some consideration that this building could become something under Yangon Heritage Trust and would provide a permanent endowment to us as well. So that's a possibility that we're exploring. So I think I've just run out of time, so I'll end it there and perhaps take any couple of questions if people have. Thank you very much. If anyone has any questions. Yes, please, sir.
Are you familiar with the Palace Hotel in 55th and Madison? And it had a facade of some distinction, and then they built this rather handsome tower behind it to preserve the facade. Are there any such comparable efforts afoot?
No, I mean, it's been discussed as an option, I guess, for some buildings, but I don't think we've reached that stage yet. I mean, I think ideally we would have a proper public discussion on all the options. And it would also depend, I think, street by street. I mean, one of the things we have to do is, now that we have this initial conservation zone agreed, is to really do a much more detailed assessment in terms of what guidelines there could be street by street. Options like that could be a possibility, but I think it's in a way, those kinds of things are less for us to decide and more things that we should present to the public as things that they might want to think about. But no, it hasn't been tried. Yes, ma'am.
I remember being in Burma and seeing the magnificent, probably 100 or more year-old trees on the street, which were very much a part of the urban architecture and formed an experience there. Is there any effort to work with the preservation and replanting of the treescapes?
We've talked about this in terms of our advocacy, but also about the protection of a lot of the green areas, the parks and the areas around the two main lakes in the city as well. Rangoon lost thousands of trees as a result of Cyclone Nargis in 2008. So almost all of the larger trees were uprooted during the cyclone. And then, of course, as a result of some of the widening of the roads with the new traffic, some trees have been lost as well. But there hasn't been any specific attempt to survey or count the trees and have a specific policy in regard to that. Yes?
It's remarkable how you describe it's remarkable how you describe the success you've had with the President's Office. And I'm interested to know, when you said the President's Office was giving out the phone number of the Heritage Trust, how has your relationship been now with developers? Have you managed to kind of have any cooperation with them, or have you won any over?
Yeah, it's not the President's Office, it was the city government. But with the developers, this is kind of where we are right now. I mean, in a way, I think, we were not seen, I think we were off their radar screen until recently with the zoning plan and everything else and our success at halting some of these projects. I think many of them see us in an adversarial role. And I think the message that they're trying to put out is that conservation is anti-development and anti-modernization. Of course, this is a city that needs thousands of more units of office space and everything else. And so we really need to get our message across in terms of our vision for the city, but also engage with the local business community as well. These are not foreign businessmen coming in, these are local businessmen. We have some that have been very supportive from the beginning, and we have some who from the beginning have said, I might be able to make some money out of this project, but I'm going to live in this city the rest of my life, and I want it to be the nicest city possible. But then others think differently. And so really trying to engage the business community is important, but I think even more important is, I think partly because of the country's isolation, a lot of people it's hard for a lot of people to visualize what a more modern city that incorporates a lot of old buildings could look like. And in Burma, there's almost no example of an old building over 50 years that people would want to live in. And so I think we can't take for granted that that sort of vision might exist, or just by us saying it. So I think for us, just helping people in terms of visualizations and renderings of what Rangoon in the future could look like that incorporates this architectural landscape, I think would be very helpful. Yes, sir.
Are there tax and other incentives for preservation?
No, nothing like that. There's actually no property tax. And so what that means is that if you're a landowner, right now, the property prices in Rangoon have gone through the roof, right? So a house that would have been, a 4-bedroom house in Rangoon that would have been $300,000-$400,000 10 years ago is about $5 million now. And in terms of rents, a house that would have gone for $1,000 in the mid-2000s might be $20,000 a month today. Even a very small, not very nice apartment is $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a month. So what a lot of landowners, and many of them are actually quite poor, and many of them are actually Indian families that have been living downtown for a long time, they suddenly believe that the house or the building that they have, the 4-, 5-, 6-story building that they have, could be sold for $50 million because somebody can knock it down and build a 100-story building in that place. They don't pay any property tax. They have no incentive to do anything other than wait for a developer to come along to make a deal with them. And so the incentive structures all go against the maintenance of these buildings and any sort of conservation effort.
In the world of natural conservation, there have been quite successful efforts where you require a tax at the time of sale that goes for conservation purposes. The same might be done with preservation.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what we need to look at, are the 3 or 4 realistic, enforceable, and this is also a setting where bureaucratic enforcement is very difficult often. Realistic and enforceable policies that might make a difference in changing the incentive structure. But we're hoping very much with World Monuments Fund and others to help identify exactly what that mix of new policies could be that we could advocate. Maybe one last question. Yeah, please. The air. Yeah, it's not very good. Because the cars are, the cars tend to be slightly older cars, and the buses are very bad. So it's not very good. It's not very good. Please.
So a really a daunting task for you in terms of your scope. But were you thinking of expanding to other parts of the country also?
No, we have our hands full on this. It's. I think the most that we could do is, if we're even halfway successful over the next couple of years, then I think if people wanted to establish something similar in Mandalay or Moulmein or elsewhere, that we could share our lessons learned in a way, and maybe eventually also help work towards a national urban conservation law. But right now we haven't, and especially with issues like Pagan and others, we haven't been involved at all. We just haven't had the time or the capacity to do that. Right. Thank you very much for coming.